In so many ways, 2020 started off like any other year here at Otago. We began the year with all of our back-to-school celebrations. We held orientation, we had our opening convocation, and in the beginning, a lot of these things they were happening somewhere else, and they weren't directly affecting us here at Otago. For us, the immediate impact of the WHO pandemic announcement meant that our Chinese students couldn't come to join us. And that really took up a huge amount of our time and thinking in the beginning of 2020. Those were the students we were focused on. We started thinking first about how we could support our Chinese students who were offshore. And we began academic planning to provide them with online learning. And because this university is so traditional in its approach to education, which has stood us well for 150 years, there was a bit of resistance in the beginning in some academic areas of the university. One of the things that we did immediately was to gather together Mandarin-speaking students here on campus and had them contact personally students offshore and their families. And I think that was a really good opportunity for students who were essentially stranded in their own home country, desperately trying to get back to Otago, to speak to someone here about the kinds of support that we could provide. So I think that person-to-person communication was really best in show, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of the Mandarin speakers here at Otago who put their hand up, identified themselves, and literally sat on the phones round the clock contacting those students. So I think in that sense we did a really good job. Obviously they can continue to study with us, and as difficult as that might be, many of those Chinese students are sticking with us because they still see this as an interim step to coming on campus. One of the things we were really lucky in New Zealand is that the Prime Minister provided us with very clear, compassionate, and almost daily updates about her thinking. And when she initially set forth the alert levels, I thought, all right, this is actually going to go someplace that we probably have not anticipated. And at that stage, the senior leadership team started meeting daily. And it was those daily updates that we were all bringing together information that we had from various places that indicated that the train was going only one way, and that was towards lockdown. So I think it was initially watching her publish the alert system indicated that there would be a level 4 and that we needed to get our house in order to be able to provide education under those circumstances. One of the decisions that we made early on was to pause our teaching only for a week. Once the Prime Minister made the announcement that we would be going into lockdown at midnight on the Wednesday, we paused our teaching on Monday, but the decision that we made was to begin teaching the following Monday with a very brief break. And not every university made that decision. But our thinking on this was that every single thing in our students' lives was in upheaval. And the one thing that we could do to provide some normalcy and some consistency was to keep the teaching on track. So we did make the decision early on that we would only take that 1 week break and then immediately jump back into it. Now, initially, a handful of students emailed me and said they were finding it difficult and they were aware that other universities had taken a greater pause and had Otago thought about taking a longer break. And I responded personally to each of the students who contacted me, and I explained the rationale that really what we wanted to do was to have something constant in their life. And not a single student balked at that. They all understood the reasoning, and I think now in hindsight, they're very grateful that we made that decision because they're finished with semester 1, and many of their other colleagues around the country are still in the heat of either their lectures or their exams. When I reflect on some of the things that happened in the beginning, there were a lot of times when I was getting high-level briefings from the Ministry of Health, from the Ministry of Education, from the TEC, from my own staff. But some of the biggest changes in my own thinking actually came from interactions with students. And in particular, I have a former Chinese PhD student who is now my postdoc. And I was speaking to her in the early phases of the pandemic. And we were talking about her own family in China. So her parents were in lockdown at the time, and she was describing how they were going about their daily life, that only one person could go out to get groceries. They could only be out for 30 minutes. And she said it was a really good thing because it was keeping them safe. And I remember clearly saying to her, that's amazing, but that could never happen in a Western democratic country. There would never be an instance where a government could force their citizens to stay home. And of course, fast forward just a matter of a few weeks, and that was exactly what had happened here in New Zealand. So I think in thinking back for me, that really demonstrates how quickly my thinking changed about not only the seriousness of the pandemic, but also the lengths that we were going to have to go in New Zealand and at the University of Otago in order to keep our own people safe. I think one of the greatest achievements of the lockdown was the lengths that academic staff went to maintain contact with their students. So the technical distribution of the lecture material may not have been world-class. It wasn't designed to be world-class. It was a response to an emergency. But what was world-class was the human, face-to-face virtual interaction that staff had with students. And I know so many of them held multiple additional tutorials, were available almost on call to students on Zoom or by text or by email to help students adjust to this new learning environment. So I'm not for a minute going to claim that the online teaching that we did would compete with the best online teaching in the world. But I am willing to bet that the human contribution to that online teaching would be absolutely best in show. And certainly the emails that I've received from students during lockdown and since lockdown have really highlighted how much they appreciated the huge amount of support that they received from their teachers and their tutors at a time which for many of them was very, very difficult. Otago made the decision, again, very early on, that the colleges would remain open and that we would continue to look after students throughout the alert levels. And the Ministry of Health was really keen on that strategy because their concern was that students might go back into their communities, and although COVID-19 wouldn't affect them as badly if they were positive, it might in fact infect their grandparents and their elderly neighbors. So they were really, really keen for us to keep them here. And we were keen to have them. And one of the great things about collegiate life at Otago is that our students have live-in adults who are there with them 24 hours a day. So all of our collegiate staff not only work with students during their working hours, but they actually live directly on site, which meant that the colleges were a perfect place to look after young people during lockdown. So in one college, for example, we might have had 75 students, and at the same time we probably had 7 to 10 staff who were living with them during the lockdown, providing them with outstanding care 24 hours a day. And I think that constant presence of other caring adults really helped to support students in collegiate life during the lockdown. In the beginning, I think the students who stayed behind probably felt a little uncertain because their collegiate life was different. They had to maintain social distancing. They had to establish smaller bubbles within their bigger college bubble. I think they probably were uncertain about how things were going to unfold. But the colleges, as you might expect, really rose to the challenge and created normalcy out of a completely abnormal situation. And they really went above and beyond to provide these students with a fun and engaging and, community of care environment while also supporting them in their studies. The students who stayed behind in the colleges were obviously posting on Facebook about what they were doing and how they were feeling. And it wasn't long before students who had gone home were contacting the university to find out when they were going to be able to come back. And when the signal came that they could come back, some of the students arrived with their bags on their college doorstep at midnight saying, okay, we're here. So I think that's a really good signal of how the students who had gone home had already felt this really strong connection to their college, but also how students who remained in the colleges were sending signals out to their college mates around New Zealand saying, we're really having a great time and we miss you, you need to come home. One of the first things that I saw with the professional staff was that everybody took charge of their own area and got stuff done. Again, if I think back to last year, one of the things that characterizes Otago is that we don't change rapidly. We like to think about things. We like to debate them endlessly. But COVID really stopped all that, and it gave people permission and license to do what they thought was best in their particular area of the university. So, by way of a few examples, the chief operating officer came to me about a month before lockdown and said he was going to move 50% of his critical staff off site. And I thought he was crazy, thought he was really overreacting and that he was going to scare people. But I said, you do what you think is best. And thank goodness he did, because it meant that we were able to continue with payroll and IT and a whole host of things, because he had the foresight that we were going to need to have some people off-site. But that happened throughout the university, not only at the highest levels of the chief operating officer. What amazed me was watching how different parts of the university really took charge of their own activity. By way of one really public example, in pharmacy, the city and the country was running out of hand sanitizer. So they took it upon themselves to become a production facility, producing literally liters and liters and liters of hand sanitizer for emergency services. I don't think they asked anybody if they could do it. I don't think they sought permission from the head of the department or the dean or the pro-vice chancellor, and they certainly didn't ask me. But thank goodness they had the foresight to just take charge of something that they could do. The same thing happened with IT. Many of the IT experts started running Zoom tutorials with people to help get them online, to facilitate moving teaching materials. They made themselves accessible to people at a moment's notice. And again, somebody must have been leading that, but it certainly wasn't me. It was that area and the leaders in that area and people like Emerson Pratt who just really galvanized their people to do whatever they had to do in order to keep the university running. Recreation support services. The gym was completely closed, but they then provided a full online program of activity and exercise for students, both on campus and those students who had gone home for the duration of lockdown. Again, I don't recall them asking permission or seeking advice. They just did what they thought was necessary during these unprecedented conditions. And those examples were repeated throughout the university. And it just happened over and over and over again. And that's one of the things that I hope we don't lose coming out of COVID. I hope we can continue to be brave and be bold and take decisions that we need to take at the time they need to happen so that stuff can get done. Rather than getting ourselves caught up in a complex decision-making process where lots of people have to be consulted about this, that, and the other thing. There are lots of instances in which that has to happen, but there are so many instances where we just need to empower the people at the coalface to do the job that needs to be done. And this university has demonstrated time and time again during COVID-19 that we've got the ability to do that. I think one of the great things that the Prime Minister did during the New Zealand's response was to talk about our team of 5 million. And I think that provides an outstanding framework for us to think about how Otago responded, because within the team of 5 million, we also had our team of 25,000 staff and students. And every single member of that team played their part. So in addition to staying at home in order to save lives in New Zealand, our staff and students were still going about their business of providing education and of learning. So every single person here did something in order to make that possible. So from the senior leadership level, we were really, really lucky to have the support of public health officials and experts from our own university. those people that were advising the Prime Minister were also advising us. And that was a huge advantage that allowed us to work our way through complex material, to learn about a virus that none of us knew anything about, and to feel really confident in the decisions that we were making. So I'm incredibly grateful that we had that expertise. But we had other expertise as well. We had emergency management expertise. We had communications expertise. We had academic staff who just a few weeks earlier were arm wrestling with parts of the university about providing education online, immediately getting their materials and making them available to students. We had professional staff who made that possible. I've often laughed, and my adult children laugh, that the irony has not escaped them that it was boomers teaching Zoomers, and the boomers definitely didn't have the technical expertise, many of us, to do the kinds of things that we were asked to do. So in many instances, it was students helping staff to get their materials online or supporting them when they couldn't figure out what to do on Zoom. So it was a real community effort, teamwork by 25,000 people in order to get through a semester that we have now completed very successfully. One of the biggest changes at the university over the last few years has been the establishment of the scotago team. And they were really at the front line during much of the university's response to COVID-19. They provided a huge amount of support to both staff and students with respect to their daily welfare checks, where they literally rang or contacted people by email who were alone or who were unwell, to check on them on a daily basis. And again, I think that signals the huge human-to-human contact that we tried to provide at the university, even though we were all locked down in our own home bubbles. The other really important service that scotago provided, which in many ways I think saved us during the pandemic, was their very clear and careful communication. They were the one source of truth. When people from the outside or from university staff and students contacted them, they had the answers to the questions, and there was only one answer. And I think that really helped people to get a clear sense that the university was under control. Scotago's response to questions was sometimes updated 3 or 4 times a day because the situation was evolving very quickly, and there's no way that we could have distributed that level and frequency of change in any other way if we didn't have scotago. So as one of the newest services on campus, they've really had their mettle tested during the pandemic, and I couldn't be prouder of what they have provided. One of the things that positioned us really well for responding to the challenges of COVID-19 was the incident management team, which is led by Andy Ferguson. And we are really lucky to have Andy at the helm. He has stood beside us during other emergencies in the past. And he's also a person who is very concerned about training not only his staff, but also training us. And he's got systems and procedures in place to deal with any emergency that might happen. So I felt, as I always feel when Andy takes control of an emergency, that we were in really good hands. He continued and continues to provide steadfast advice to me and to the university. He's gained the trust and the respect of the vast majority of the university community, who depends on him to provide us with advice, to make sure that the water's going to continue to run and that the electricity will still work and that we'll have sufficient rations and supplies no matter what happens. And so I think the university was served incredibly well by having that depth of talent as part of our team of 25,000. I think one of the most important lessons that we learned in response to the pandemic is the value of teamwork. So very early on, the senior emergency management team started meeting daily. And that group obviously consists of the Vice Chancellor's Advisory Group, but it was also supported by other expertise around the university. So Andy Ferguson, as the head of the emergency management team, is part of that group. We had Megan McPherson, the Director of Communications, was part of that team. We had public health expertise in the form of Professor Philip Hill, who participated in that team. And we also had our OUSA president, Mr. Jack Manning. So we had quite broad coverage around the university, and we met every single day, initially in person in the lead up to the lockdown, and then during the lockdown, we met every day by Zoom. And those daily meetings allowed every person who held a leadership position to communicate to the others what was happening in their particular portfolio. It also allowed people to feed information in to each other that they had learned from other sources or problems that we had to solve. We put our heads together and we made decisions. We made them quickly on limited information because that's what we had. But because all of the people were in the Zoom room at a time, I think the decisions we made were really good. So again, I don't want to lose that teamwork going forward. I think every senior leader at the university now knows more not only about their own portfolio, but also about the portfolio of all the other senior leaders than they ever would have taken the time to learn before. It does feel like everyone had everyone else's back and that people were prepared to provide fair and frank advice, critique, commentary about what was happening. So I think collectively, because we worked so well together, the level and the quality of the decisions that we made were much better than they would have been had we all been off in our own little areas. And because we also had that lovely contribution of public health advice, everything that we were doing was consistent with what was happening in the rest of the country. And we were making the decisions that were not only best for education, but also best for the safety of our staff and students. The question I've been asked the most, why in the world did you put a student on the senior executive team? And I think for us, the decision was really very simple. The University of Otago, first and foremost, is a school, and it was important for us to have input from the student community about the kinds of decisions that we were making. It was a risk because we brought Jack inside the tent and he had access to every piece of information that the other senior leaders had, including all of the sensitive financial information, all of the government briefing information that we had. And his contribution was equal to every other member of that team. Jack kept our moral compass focused fiercely on students, which is the way it should have been. He raised issues with us that we needed to consider. We worked through our solutions with him. We road tested ideas with him, which he then subsequently road tested with the student community. And I think it allowed us to move through some complex and potentially controversial decisions in a much more successful way than would have been possible without Jack's contribution. And it wasn't only Jack. I mean, Jack was in the senior tent, but many other members of the OUSA exec also made invaluable contributions during the pandemic. Emily Coyle, who is the education officer, was a fundamental member of the team that was developing the online exam system. She was fundamental in bringing the discussion about the grade bump to the table. So these young people really were working well beyond their years, but the university's response to COVID-19 is better because of the contributions that they made. One of the greatest gifts that we have in the New Zealand tertiary education system is that our academic freedom is enshrined in legislation. We are really obliged to be the critic and conscience of society. And when we reflect on COVID-19, obviously there was a lot of our experience that made us fearful and uncertain and challenged our thinking about a whole host of things. But the one thing that gave me immense confidence during this whole process was the incredible depth of talent the University of Otago has in the area of public health. Many of our academics stood up quite boldly and very early to say things that not everybody wanted to hear. So Our contribution, not only the contribution of those people to the university, but more importantly perhaps to the nation, is a source of immense pride, not only for me, but I suspect for the entire university. It was amazing to watch people who I have known for years, whose work I have respected, whose opinions I value, including people like Sir David Skegg, Professor David Murdoch, Professor Philip Hill, Dr. Aisha Verrill, Professor Michael Baker, Professor Nick Wilson. I mean, these are people I have known for a very long period of time, and all of a sudden they were becoming common knowledge throughout New Zealand because they were providing the words of wisdom to the government about how we should react. And right now, if we look at the way in which New Zealand is positioned internationally, our response to COVID-19, the Prime Minister's leadership, the leadership of the Director General of Health, is being held up as best in show. But I think we all need to acknowledge that the reason that the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health could do their job so well is because they took the advice of the experts here at the University of Otago. And internationally, this needs to be a model going forward, not only for this disaster, but for any disaster, that universities have an amazing wealth of knowledge that can be used for the common good. And we saw that day after day after day during COVID-19, where experts around the university stepped up to help. The danger of hindsight in reviewing how the university or the country responded to the pandemic is to assume that we had time. We never had the luxury of time. Everything was happening and changing quite dramatically. We started talking about COVID time as being 48 hours, that this is our decision now, but in 48 hours we're going to have to reconsider it. So I'm not sure we could have done anything differently because everything we did was a function of new information that we were receiving. In many ways, it's probably good that in the beginning we didn't know how it would end because we had to do things in the beginning that we would have been quite fearful about, I think, if we would have known where we were headed. So we just approached each decision as it came before us. And I'm thinking, for example, of the issue of the number of students that we had abroad, and we haven't really talked about that. That in addition to international students who were stuck and couldn't get to Otago, we also had a large number of study abroad students and trainee interns who were overseas at the beginning of the pandemic. And the question was, should we call them home or not? And for me, the biggest lesson learned was as the virus started infecting countries where our students were located, like Italy, for example, and we called our students back from Italy. And we got a lot of pushback in the beginning from students, from parents saying, this isn't a big deal, you're overreacting, let them stay, it will be fine. And I remember having those conversations with students and with families. And within 72 hours, things had changed so dramatically that those same students were on flights coming back to New Zealand. So it's that rapid pace in which the world changed dramatically that would have made it impossible, I think, for us to make decisions in a different way. You know, in hindsight, there were also things that if a pandemic was going to happen, thank goodness we had done some stuff. So our university Wi-Fi, for example, the upgrades that we had done to IT in the last few years. Imagine if we hadn't done that, what would happen? Imagine if we didn't have Ask Otago, what would have happened? Imagine if we didn't have key people in the roles who were in those roles, who had many of them had recently joined the university or had recently taken up the role that they had. Imagine if they weren't there. So rather than thinking about would we have done anything differently, most of my thinking is how grateful I am that we had the people and the resources on hand to help us get through. I couldn't have asked more from the staff and students. I mean, seriously, there's nothing when I think back, what would I wanted people to do that they didn't do? There's nothing. I think everyone rose to the challenge. Life went on. stuff happened. Research got done. Education happened. People looked after each other. We met payroll. Every critical service at this university continued uninterrupted during the pandemic. The colleges continued to provide outstanding care and education to our students. So I think we need to, I just need to express my huge gratitude to everyone who did their part for this university, while at the same time, some people educating their children, looking after family, looking after neighbors. People demonstrated a huge amount of resilience and community spirit. And for that, I think we are all very lucky.